The Marlowe Lecture Series on Economic and Monetary Policy is a series of annual lectures and symposiums supported through the generosity of Mr. Hubert Marlowe, President, Founder, and Director of Palos Management. In December 2020, Dr. Andrew Lowe, Professor of Finance and Director of the Laboratory for Financial Engineering at the MIT Sloan School of Management, delivered the signature Marlowe Lecture, Financial Market Dynamics and Systemic Risk in a Post-COVID World. An award-winning researcher, teacher, and prolific author, his most recent book, Adaptive Markets, Financial Evolution at the Speed of Thought, details his adaptive markets hypothesis, which blends rational and behavioral financial economics into a unified model based on biological ecosystems and evolutionary theory. Following his lecture, Dr. Lowe generously agreed to answer some questions. An expanded version of this interview can be read in the University of Ottawa Gazette, but excerpts are included in this video. Welcome, Professor. I'd like to start by discussing the effects of COVID-19 on you as a professor. MIT has been a leader in online instruction through initiatives like MIT OpenCourseWare. And I'm wondering if you see COVID affecting post-secondary education in the long term. Are there going to be lasting effects?
Oh, without a doubt, I think the effects will be huge, but in a couple of different ways. One is that now that we understand what is truly possible with online technology, I think you're going to see a lot more online offerings in the coming years, including online degrees. And we've had them to some degree, but you're not going to have, you're going to see an explosion of online degrees from, top flight universities in the next few years, thanks to this technology. So that's one implication. But I think there's another implication, which is that we're going to change the way we teach online. So for example, when I started teaching online in March, I was extremely frustrated. I basically went online just like we are right now, without a lot of the technology that I've ultimately developed and had to build myself. So over the course of the summer and then this past fall, I developed a whole different set of approaches, including, when I gave the Marlowe lecture, you saw that, I was basically using a weatherman type of an approach with slides. And if it were a regular lecture, I would have used the chat window. I would have used the poll feature to get students to answer questions. I would have had sound effects and more animation. So it would have been a lot more dynamic. And I think that is one of the benefits of COVID.
I'd like to follow up on some of your remarks regarding inflation. In today's financial markets, is it possible that people are freaking in as opposed to freaking out? And is there a way to construct an inflationary index on financial assets that would gauge whether those assets are drifting in price, similar to consumer goods?
I think there is, but we have to collect a different kind of data. So one of the reasons that I went to the trouble of developing this alternative theory, I'm not a theorist by training or trade. My background is really in empirical finance and econometrics. But I went to the trouble of developing this theory because I realized that our models don't work. They don't fit the data. It's exactly as you point out, not just with stock models, but with macroeconomic models. And so one of the things that I realized was we're not actually measuring the right quantities. We're not modeling the economy as an ecosystem that has different species. What we need to be doing is collecting data on the biomass of each species. So if you were an ecologist trying to understand deforestation in the Amazon rainforest, and somebody were to ask you to go and do a study and to explain what kind of government policies should be implemented to save the rainforest, the first thing you would do is not sit down at your desk and write an equation or two. The first thing you would do is to take a flight to the Amazon and spend a month studying the ecosystem and cataloging all of the different species, all the predator-prey relationships, all of the various different flora and fauna, to understand why it is the case that deforestation is occurring and why you're having certain species go extinct. And after you do your data collection, after all of that information is put together, do you then sit down and try to model this thing?
In describing the markets as an ecosystem, you identify that various actors are grouped into species, different kinds of funds, retail investors. Do we have enough data with respect to what these different species are doing and how they're acting? Is there a framework in place? Who would construct it and who would it be for?
There isn't. That's one of the reasons why I've been writing more and more. I'm trying to motivate people to go out and collect the data, because to me, that's where the answers are to the questions that you and others have asked about market dynamics. We've been trying to analyze markets with respect to very, very simplistic economic models like, dividend discount model or random walks and so on, when in fact, what we need to do is to look at the system as if it were an ecosystem, and then to try to map it out more systematically. Nobody's doing it now, as far as I know. Maybe some hedge funds out there have some very, very specialized models for certain segments of the market. I suspect that some of the most talented traders, people like George Soros and others, they have in their heads this kind of a model. They understand the economy in a way that ecologists would, I think, appreciate, and that's how they make their bets. But apart from people like Soros and Warren Buffett and these very talented traders, I don't think that we economists are doing a very good job of collecting the relevant data.
You've mentioned that there's been some resistance to the adaptive market hypothesis due to not having necessarily the physics aspects of it spelled out as much as you might want. How are things going in terms of academic acceptance? Are you seeing some traction?
I am. I have to say, it's gratifying. It's taking time because, as I mentioned in my talk, my colleagues and we all suffer from this notion of physics envy. We like to have, a mathematical framework, an axiomatic framework that gives us implications that we can then test. I started reading more about behavioral finance because I had these models that I was testing, and all of the tests came back negative. I was rejecting the random walk hypothesis, rejecting many other theories, and I started reading about behavioral finance because everybody was saying, oh, it's because it's human behavior. The more I read about behavioral finance, that brought me into neuroscience, which brought me into evolutionary biology. And I realized something. I realized that biologists don't have nearly the same level of precision as physicists. And yet biologists, particularly evolutionary biologists and ecologists, they're actually able to come up with some beautiful ideas, beautiful theories that they can then test and that have actual substantive empirical implications. You don't have to have strict mathematical precision and elegance to have an important observation. That actually freed me up to start thinking really about what was going on. And the more I looked at financial markets, the more I said, this does not look like a physical system. This looks to me like an ecosystem with lots of different species competing with each other. I plan to write a book, probably will be published next year by Oxford University Press, that will describe some of the mathematics. But to me, the mathematics comes second to the insight that, we are a bunch of animals competing with each other.
Well, we've come to the end of our time, and I'd like to thank you for your generosity. In closing, if you had something to say to a general university audience about COVID-19, the financial markets, the state we're in, what would that be?
The most important message that I would like to communicate to a university audience is that the pandemic is a very finite event. It will be over in the next 6 to 9 months. But during that time, there's tremendous risk, both financial risk, but more importantly, health risk to individuals as well as to the community. So I think that we can't celebrate just yet. We have to hold off on the parties and the get-togethers. And it's very difficult for us to do that. By human nature, we are all social animals. But even introverts like me have been feeling the lack of human contact, and Zoom does not do it for me or anybody else that I know. And so I would say particularly to university students that they need to be extraordinarily careful. And I want students to just remember that their actions have tremendous implications that go far beyond the next 6 to 9 months. So if we can stay safe and healthy and look forward to the time when we're all vaccinated and we can gather together without endangering anybody's lives, that's something that we ought to strive for.
Our next lecturer in the Marlowe series will be Dr. Emi Nakamura on April the 30th. Dr. Nakamura is the Chancellor's Professor of Economics at the University of California, Berkeley. She is an award-winning and highly cited researcher in inflation and price dispersion, monetary and fiscal policy. More details can be found on the Marlowe series webpage. We'll see you there.